Okay, in this video, we'll work through the chapter 6 homework, starting with problem 1. The main, most of these, there's really only about 3 real problems in this, even though there's 20 questions. They're all kind of related, but they're basically rotate around 3 problems. All right, so the first problem here, we have Isabel, who's going to start a vaping business. And we're going to jot down the demand and the supply curves. So P equals 10 minus 1 over 200 Q. And then supply is price equals 2.5 plus 1 over 400 Q. And we want to find the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So I jotted down the formulas. We're now going to take them and set them equal to each other. So we get 10 minus 1 over 200 Q equals 2.5 plus 1 over 400 Q. So this is review, right? So we're going to subtract 2.5 from both sides. We get 7.5. And then we're going to add 1 over 200 to both sides. Well, to make this a common fraction, I'm going to multiply this by 2 over 2. So I get 2 over 400. So now I'm adding 2 over 400 Q to 1 over 400 Q. That gives me 3 over 400 Q. And then I'm going to multiply both sides by 400 over 3. And that'll let me cancel out here, and I get Q is equal to, grab my calculator, 400 times 7.5 divided by 3 equals 1,000. And then to get the equilibrium price, I plug that 1,000 into either one of these. So I get P equals 10 minus 1 over 200 times 1,000. 1,000 divided by 200 is 5. 10 minus 5 is 5. So the equilibrium price and quantity is 1,005. Oh, we can do the same over here. So I can say P equals 2.5 plus 1 over 400 times 1,000. So 1,000 divided by 400 is 2.5 plus 2.5 gives me 5. So either one, again, will work, right? You don't have to do both. Either one would work. I'm just kind of showing you that you could have taken the quantity and put it into either one. So that's the answer to question 1. Let's go back to the, okay, question 2. At equilibrium, what is Isabel's producer surplus? All right. So now we're going to go, and then, so it's producer surplus, consumer surplus. So this is still review. So we'll do both of those. I'm going to do both of those together. All right. So in order to calculate that, the best thing to do is to draw out our graph, right? And so we have our demand curve is P equals 10 minus 1 over 200. So if Q is 0, then P is 10. And when P is 0, Q is 10 equals 1 over 200. 200 times 10 is 2,000. So I'm doing that in my head. Let me, just so anybody's getting lost. So I'm trying to find, I found the y-intercept, which is really easy. All I have to do is set Q equal to 0. And when I set Q equal to 0, that term goes away, and all I'm left with is 10. Now I'm going to set P equal to 0. So if I have P equals 10 minus 1 over 200 Q, and I set P equal to 0, I get 10 minus 1 over 200 Q. I add 1 over 200 Q to both sides. Then I multiply both sides by 200. All right, that cancels, and I get Q equals 10 times 200, which is 2,000. So that gives me that. All right, so now I can draw a straight line connecting those two. That's my demand curve. right? And then I have a supply curve of 2.5 plus 1 over 400Q. So that is something like this. And then 1 over 400Q is a very flat slope. So it's going to look something like that, right? It's almost horizontal line. And so my equilibrium quantity and my equilibrium price, right? And we said that the equilibrium price was 5 and the equilibrium quantity was 1,000. So equals 5 and Q equilibrium equals 1,000, right? So that line, those lines are here and here, and this intercept was 2.5, right? Because it's 2.5 here. So consumer surplus is this triangle, right? And so this triangle is, so to get my consumer surplus, I want the area of this triangle. Well, the area of this triangle is, it's 10 high minus 5, right? Because the triangle just goes down to 5, times the width, which is 1,000, times 1/2, because it's height, base, 1/2, right? I flip-flopped them, but normally base height, 1/2, whatever, doesn't matter. You can reorder them. So I've got 5 times 1,000 times 1/2. Well, 5 times 1,000 is 5,000. Half of 5,000 is 2,500. So the consumer surplus is 2,500. That's this, the area of this triangle. And then the producer surplus is the triangle below the price, but above the supply curve here, right? So what's that? Well, the producer surplus then is the height, 5 minus 2.5, right? Because we just want the height of the triangle, not all the way down to the origin. It's just this area here, right? So that's the height. The base is 1,000. It's all the way over, times 1/2. So 5 minus 2.5 is 2.5. 2.5 times 1,000 is 2,500. Half of 2,500 is 1,250. Okay, so that's the area here, 1,250. So that's the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. All right. Now, get a little more interesting, because that was chapter 4. So go back to sharing. Okay. So producer surplus, consumer surplus. Now, assume the state of New Hampshire imposes a $1 per vape tax payable by the seller. What is the new equilibrium price and quantity for Isabel's vape business? So what do we have to do? We have to go back here and think through what we're looking at. So let's start with the base. And the base was here, right? And so it's important to note who's paying the tax. And you were told that the seller is paying the tax. So this is a tax on Isabel, right? So it's going to impact her costs. So if I redraw her line, right? So she starts at, I'm going to make it a little steeper just for visual purposes. So that's her supply curve. The demand curve, right, was 2010, and our initial was 1,005, right? That was our initial equilibrium. Now, Isabel is being forced to pay a $1 tax on every vape that she sells. So if she sells one vape, she has to pay whatever the price is plus $1. So what that effectively does is it increases her supply curve. So her original supply curve was P equals 2.5 plus 1 over 400Q. with the tax version, it is 2.5 plus 1, or 3.5 plus 1 over 400 Q. And if we're going to draw that on our graph, what does that look like? Well, it's going to start at 3.5 because that's the new intercept, right? And it's going to go up, but it still has the same slope. So it's going to go up at the same rate as before, right? So these two lines are parallel. That's what those two hash tags mean is, or hash marks mean, is that they are parallel. So how much does Isabel have? Now, Isabel, essentially what has happened, right? This is a left shift or an upward shift of the supply curve. And what do we know about up or left shifts of the supply curve? Well, they happen when costs to the producer go up in any way. And the tax is essentially a cost to Isabel that she has to pay to the state. The result is a new price that she has to charge in order to stay in business. And it's a higher charge than before. And we're also going to see, right, so it's some new price, right? And we're also going to see a smaller quantity. Okay. How do we figure out what this new price is? Well, what we're going to do is, this is her tax supply curve, and we're going to take her tax supply curve and set it equal to the original demand curve, because nothing has happened to our consumers. They're still going along, as we used to say in the Army, fat, dumb, and happy. So they don't know that anything has changed. So we're going to put their demand curve in here. They still want their vapes just like they used to. But now we're going to use the new tax supply curve, which is 3.5 plus 1 over 400 Q. And now we have to solve again for the new Q. So 10 minus 3.5 is 6.5. Add 2 over 400, right? I'm going to convert that into 2 over 400 so I can add it over here. And back to 3 over 400 Q. Multiply both sides by 400 over 3 in order to cancel. I'm back here. 400 times 6.5 equals 2,600 divided by 3. I get 866, dot, dot, dot. So let's just call that 867. So the new Q is 867. That's this, right? And then my new price that, this is where you have to be careful. You can't just use any of these. You have to use either the price under tax for the supply curve or the original demand curve. I like to use the demand curve because I'm looking for what this number is right here, right? This price. So I'm going to take 867 and I'm going to put it into my demand function. 10 minus 1 over 200 times 867. And I'm going to solve. So 866 divided by 200, right? 4.33 minus 10. And I get 5.66. So the new price that's going to be paid by the consumers, because the number on the demand curve, the price that hits the demand curve, that's what the consumers are paying. So the consumer price, right, price to consumer is 566. What is going to be the price to Isabel? Or what price is Isabel going to get? Well, Isabel gets where the volume crosses her supply curve. And this is going to make this is a little weird, but it'll make sense in a second. So we take the 867 and we plug it into her original supply curve. And like I said, you'll see how this makes sense in just a second. So P equals 2.5 plus 1 over 400 times 867. 867 divided by 400 is 2.1675 plus 2.5, and we get 467. So Isabel is going to get 467, right? All right. So the price to Isabel, the PP, right? Price to producer is 467. Price to consumer is 566, 567. Let's just round that. 567, right? How about that? And what's the difference? 567 minus 467. 567 minus 467 minus 467 gives me $1. And what's $1? That's the tax, right? That's the tax. So that's the tax wedge between what Isabel charges and what she actually gets to keep. So that starts to make some sense, right? That becomes a little more intuitive. You're going to take the volume, the new volume based on the tax supply curve, right? You figure out the new volume, then you plug the new volume into the demand curve to get the price that the consumers will pay. And you take the new volume and you plug it into the original supply curve, and you get the amount of money that the producer is going to get. And the wedge between them, or the difference between them, is going to represent the tax. So if you've done it right, that matches up. You're going to have the gap, or the difference between the price to the producer and the price to the consumer, is going to equal the tax. So since we did it right, we got the right answer. All right, so let's go back. So question 4, what is the new equilibrium price and quantity for Isabel's vape business? Well, it's 567. That's the price she's actually going to charge, 567. She's only going to get to keep 467. Okay. So when I say what's the new equilibrium price, I'm looking for the price that's actually being charged. That's 567, even though Isabel is actually receiving net of taxes 467. All right. So then new tax equilibrium. Okay. Then we want to figure out now what her new producer surplus is and what her new consumer surplus is. And then also how much taxes are collected and what is the deadweight loss. I think there's a mistake there. I'll fix that. All right. So new producer, let's start with consumer surplus. The new consumer surplus is going to be the price the consumers pay, right? The triangle below the demand curve and above what the price that the consumers pay. So that's going to be their consumer surplus. So to calculate consumer surplus, we need to calculate the area of that little triangle on top. So we could do the height is 10 high minus 5.67. So 10 minus 5.67, that's the height, right? We're not going to go all the way down. It's just down to there. And then it is 867 across times a half. So we get 10 minus 5.67 gives us 433 times 867 divided by 2 gives us 1,877. That's the consumer surplus. The new producer surplus is the price the producer actually gets to keep down to her supply curve, right? So it's this triangle. So this is the producer surplus. So what's the producer surplus? Well, it's 4.67 minus 2.5 times 867 times 1/2. 4.67 minus 2.5 gives me 2.17 times 867 gives me 1881 divided by 2 gives me 940.7. So let's just say 941. Okay. How much tax does the state collect? And yeah, definitely that was a mistake on the wrong button selected. Okay, so how much tax does the state get? Well, the state gets, let's see if I've got another color. All right, so the state gets, I'm gonna have a highlighter. The state gets this wedge in between the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Right, so it's this rectangle is the top of the rectangle is 567. The bottom of the rectangle is 467. So the difference, it's one high, 567 minus 467. So 567 minus 467. And then it is 867 wide. So that's 1 times 867 is 867. All right. And then the last question is going to be, what about the deadweight loss? Okay, well, what is the deadweight loss? Well, without the taxes, we would have had trades of 1,000. She would have sold 1,000 units of vapes, right? So she would have sold 1,000. People would have bought 1,000. There would have been happiness in the world. But the government came in and taxed and reduced the number of trades from 1,000 to 867, right? And collected some taxes. So it reduced back to here. The government got 867. The consumers got 1877. Right. Consumers got 1867. The government gets this much. Isabel gets this much. But what about this triangle? So it used to be that this whole thing would have been split between the consumers and Isabel, right? The consumers would have gotten this top half. Isabel would have gotten the bottom half. It's not quite halves, but now we're losing this triangle here. This, I'm going to black it in, right? This triangle here is going to nobody, right? The government's getting a chunk, consumers are getting a chunk, producer Isabel's getting a chunk, but nobody's getting this that used to be split between the consumer and the producer, but now nobody gets. This is the deadweight loss. Okay, and what's the area of that? Well, it's one high, right? It's the height. It's 5.67 minus 4.67. That's the height. Its base, the width is 1,000 minus 867. So it's that wide times 1/2. So it is one high times 1,000 minus 867 is 133 times 1/2. 1,000 minus 867, 133 times 1 times 0.5. We have a deadweight loss of 66.5. Right. So fixing that real quick. There we go. So producer surplus, we said, new producer surplus was 941. New consumer surplus, 1877. How much tax does does the state collect? 867. What's the deadweight loss? We said 6650. Okay, so that is kind of all based on that same one problem. And that's how this next one goes as well. So okay, so now we're going to talk about Morgana, and she's a psychotherapist. She's got her demand of 250 minus 5Q and her supply of 20 plus 8/3 Q. What's her practices? Equilibrium, price, and quantity. How much consumer surplus? How much producer surplus? So we'll do those and then come back to this problem. To the canvas. All right, so already set that up. So we want to find her equilibrium, price, and quantity. So we're going to set the two equal to each other. So we get 250 minus 5Q equals 20 plus 8/3 Q. So subtract 20 from both sides, we get 230 equals, and then we're going to add 5Q to both sides. Well, in order to add 5 and 8/3, I'm going to multiply this by 3 over 3. So 3 times 5 is 15. So 15 over 3. So I get 15 over 3Q plus 8/3 Q, which is equal to 23/3 Q. So we can just cross that out, right? So now I've got 230 equals 23 over 3Q times 3 over 23. So we can cancel out that times 3 over 23. And we get Q is equal to 3 times 230, 690 divided by 23/30. So Q is equal to 30. So now that I know Q is equal to 30, I can put 30 into either one of these. So P equals 250 minus 5 times 30. 5 times 30 is 150. 250 minus 150 is 100. Right? I could do that, or I can go over here and say P equals 20 plus 8/3 times 30. 8 times 30 is 240. Divided by 3 is 80. 80 plus 20. So this is 80, right? 80 plus 20 is 100. So both ways work, but the answer is P equals 100, Q equals 30. Okay. In order to do consumer surplus and producer surplus, the best thing to do is to draw the graph. So let's go ahead and get that done. So we've got price and quantity. So demand curve first. If Q is 0, P is 250. When P is 0, we have to solve for Q. So let's see. Just get another sheet. So we got P equals 250 minus 5Q. When P is 0, we got 250 minus 5Q. 5Q equals 250. Q equals 50. So the x-intercept then is 50. So that's my demand curve. And then when I'm drawing my supply curve, I know that when Q is 0, P is 20. And then it goes up at 8/3. 8/3 is like, is 2 2/3. That's a pretty steep line. So we just draw an up line like this. That's my supply curve. And we already calculated the equilibrium price and quantity were 130. So we can draw that in. 130. Right. Now we want to get our consumer and producer surplus. The producer's consumer surplus is the triangle above the price that the consumer pays, but below the demand curve. So that is my consumer surplus. My producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, and below the price that the producer receives. That's here. That's the producer surplus. So now we just need to just calculate those, right? So the consumer surplus is equal to 250 minus 100. It is 30 wide times 1/2. Well, 250 minus 100 is 150, right? 150, come on. 150 times 30 times 0.5, 2250. And the producer surplus is 100 minus 20, right? That's the height, times 30 wide, times 1/2. So that's 100 minus 20 is 80 times 30 divided by 2, 1200. All right, so that's it for that. That's the setup, right? That's the basic problem. We did all that stuff in chapter 4. Now we're moving on to okay. Assume that the state of New Hampshire imposes a $10 per session tax on Morgana's patients in order to fund state-provided mental health care. Morgana would collect the tax from the patient in addition to their normal fee per visit. What is the new equilibrium price paid to Morgana and quantity? So in this case, we're looking for a number that is paid to Morgana, but doesn't include the $10. So let me redraw that. A little bit bigger. So a little bit bigger for more room to maneuver. There's our demand, supply. So what's happening? Well, this time, instead of with Isabel, the government collected $1 from Isabel every time she sold something. Now the government is charging the consumer a tax. So they're going to show up, they're going to have their visit, and then the provider's going to be like, all right, that visit was X dollars plus you owe the government $10. What does that do? Well, that makes every visit, right, more expensive for the consumer. It effectively reduces the consumer's buying power by $10. And so we're going to draw, this is going to be out of proportion, but I'm going to draw it this way. D tax, and the D tax, right, is the original. So the original demand curve was 250 minus 5Q, but that 250 reflected the wealth, the income, right, the ability to pay of the patient. Under tax, though, that ability to pay is reduced by $10. So it's as if they were $10 poorer when they go to buy their mental health services. So the new P-intercept or Y-intercept, if Q is 0, P is now 240. And these lines are parallel, right? Because the 5, nothing's changed about the slope. So these lines are parallel. So now when we go to figure out what the new equilibrium quantity is, we're looking where dt crosses the supply curve. And that will be the new price that Morgana receives. All right, but in order to figure that out, we've got to figure out what this quantity is, right? And then we can translate that quantity into a price. So in order to get the new quantity, we'll start with the new taxed demand curve, 240 minus 5Q, and set it equal to Morgana's original supply curve, which is 20 plus 8/3 Q. So now solving, we'll subtract 20 from both sides. We get 220. And this, remember, is 5 times 3/3 is 15/3. Add that over here, we get 23/3Q, which is the same as we had before. So I'm kind of, and then we can do 3/23. That cancels. And over here, 3/23, right? And so now we do 220 times 3 is 660 divided by 23, 28.69. So the new taxed quantity is 28.69. And how much money? So now how much money does Morgana get? Well, she gets paid based on her supply curve. So we can take the 28.69 and put it into her supply curve. P equals 20 plus 8/3 times 28.69. So times 8 divided by 3, 76.51 plus 20. She gets 96.52. So Morgana is going to get paid, let's do this, 96.52. What about the consumer? How much is the consumer going to pay? Well, let's do the intuition real quick. When they show up, Morgana's going to say, okay, the new price is going to be 96.52, and then you owe the government $10. So how much do you think the final number then is? Well, it's going to be 96.52 plus 10, or 106.52, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'll color green for the consumer price. So I'm telling you up front, it's going to be 106.52. Let's prove it. Well, if you follow the quantity up to the original demand curve, right, because that's what they're willing to pay, it's 28.69 into the original demand curve, right, of 250 minus 5Q. So P equals 250 minus 5 times the new post-tax quantity, 28.69 times 5, make it negative, plus 250. We get 106.55. There's some rounding error in there, 106.52. Okay. And then the gap here, right, is 10, 106.52. So this is the price the consumer pays. This is the price the producer receives. The gap is the tax. How much tax does the government get? Well, it gets this rectangle is the tax. And that is 106, let's say 52 minus 96.52, or 10, right, times the width, which is 28.69. So it gets 10 times 28.69, 286.90-ish. Right. So that's the tax that the government collects. Now remember, before the government got involved, we produced this much stuff, right? We were all the way over here. And the consumer surplus was the amount below the demand curve and above the price. That would have been it. The producer surplus was the amount below the price and above the supply curve. But now the government gets involved, puts a tax on it. We have fewer trades. So we have 1.31 fewer trades. right? So now the consumers get this much. Producer gets this much, right? Below the tax price, above the supply curve, above the tax price, but below the demand curve. And then the government gets its taxes. And this wedge here is just lost. And so that's our dead weight loss. So we've got to figure out the area of that triangle. Well, that triangle is 10 high, right? It's 106.52 minus 96.52. And then it is 30 minus 28.69 wide, right? That's that wide, times 1/2. So it is 10 times 1.31 times 1/2. So 1.31 times 10 divided by 2, 655-ish. All right. So what did we say? Well, Morgana is now going to get 96.52. She was going to produce 28.69 visits. The amount of consumer surplus that Morgana accrues to Morgana's patients after they pay the tax, we said was, lost my page here. I didn't do that. Okay, so the consumer surplus after taxes, right, is 250, the height of the triangle, minus 106.52, right? So it's down from here to here. That's the height of the triangle, times 28.69, the width of the triangle, times 1/2. So we get 250 minus 106.52 is 143.48 times 28.69 is 4,116 divided by 2 is 2058. And then the producer surplus is going to be this red triangle. It's 96.52 minus 20. So 96.52 minus 20. So 76.52 times the width of 28.69 times 1/2. So we get 96.52 minus 20, 76.52 times 28.69. Oops. Try that again. 76.52 times 28.69 divided by 2, 109.7.67. All right. So 2058, 109.8, we rounded up. We talked about the taxes to the government. That's 286.9, 287, rounded up a little bit. What's the dead weight loss from tax? That's not right. All right, quick fix there. So the dead weight loss was 655. All right. So now we're going to move on to the next set of problems, which reprises Morgana. But instead of paying a tax to see Morgana, the state gives each patient a $10 subsidy in the form of a coupon that they can give to Morgana. And then she can redeem it for $10. So she's going to get an extra $10 for every patient she sees. So that's going to make her excited. What does that look like? All right. So we're going to do we're going to calculate now Morgana's response to getting the additional, being able to charge higher rates to her patients. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop the share. Now, instead of taking money away, which made the people feel less wealthy with regard to buying mental health care, the state is now giving them additional money, a subsidy, which makes them feel wealthier. So that's going to be a right shift of the demand curve. And it's going to be a right shift of the demand curve or an up shift of the demand curve of $10. So we're going to go from P equals 250 minus 5Q to P subsidy 250 plus 10, 260 minus 5Q. Now, Morgana's supply curve hasn't changed at all, but we're going from an equilibrium of 130 now to whatever this is. All right. And Morgana is going to collect a price based on where the quantity crosses her supply curve, and the patients are going to are going to pay where the quantity crosses their actual demand curve, not the, let's call this D subsidy versus just original D. So the important thing to figure out is, what's that quantity? Well, we're going to take the subsidized demand curve, 260 minus 5Q, and set it equal to the supply curve, 20 plus 8/3 Q. Subtract 20 from both sides, we get 240 equals 23 over 3Q. I'm not doing that again because we've already done it like 4 times. So times 3 over 23 times 3 over 23. I get 3 times 240. 720 divided by 223 is 3130. So Q equals 3130, right? Because this cancels, we're just calculating for Q. So the subsidized quantity is going to go up 3130. So now we can figure out, using that subsidized quantity, we can say, what is the price? Let me do red for supplier, and green for producer, red for producer, green for consumer. So PC and PP. Let me grab my. Notice how the relationship is flipped. PP was under tax, PP is on the bottom, and PC is on top. Over here, PC is on the bottom because they're paying. So PP, right, when they're being taxed, the producer gets a lower price and the consumer pays a higher price. Here, the consumer pays a lower price and the producer gets a higher price. Everybody's going to be happier, and that's why everybody likes the government to give them subsidies, right? Because the consumers are going to pay less and the producers are going to pay more, get paid more. And so they kind of reverse positions. So how much? All right. Well, to calculate the cost or price to the consumer, we're going to take the original demand curve and put the subsidized price into it. So 250 minus 5 times 3130. 5 times 31.3. make it negative, plus 250 gives us 9350, right? So the 9350. And then what does Morgana get? Well, she gets P equals 20 plus 8/3 times 3130. 31.3 times 8 divided by 3, 83 plus 20, 103.5 roughly. And wouldn't you know it, what's the difference between the producer price and the consumer price? 103.5 minus 93.5, that's $10. That's the subsidy, right? So the subsidy was 10. So there's the gap. And so you should always expect, whether it's a subsidy or a tax, that the producer price and the consumer price, when you calculate them, are going to be apart by either the tax or the subsidy. So if you've done it right, you'll get the difference will be equal to the tax or the subsidy. So how much of a subsidy is the government paying? The government is paying that much of a subsidy. Okay, so how much is the subsidy then? Well, it's 103.5 minus 93.5. So that's 10 times the width of the rectangle, 3130. So 10 times 3130 is 313 ish, right? Okay, so that's the government subsidy, total subsidy. Okay, we got that. What is the consumer surplus? Well, remember, what the consumers actually benefit from is their demand curve. The demand subsidized is irrelevant to their happiness. So their consumer surplus is below the original demand curve and above the subsidized price, the new PC, which is 93.5. And then it goes out to 3130. So the consumer surplus, right, is equal to the height of the triangle, 250 minus 9350, times the width, 3130, times 1/2. So 250 minus 93.5 gives me 156.50 times 31.3, 40 and blah, blah, divide by 2, 24.49. And some change. It's fine. Okay. How about the producer surplus? Well, the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve up to the quantity and then below the price that the producer receives. Now notice that these triangles are overlapping, right? The green triangle goes down here and overlaps, and the red triangle goes over the green triangle. And that space where they're overlapping is the subsidy. But notice, all right, so then we'll get the producer surplus. The producer surplus is equal to the height of the triangle, which is 103.5 minus 20 times the width, 3130, times 1/2. 103.5 minus 20, 83.5 times 31.3 divided by 2 gives us 1306.8-ish. So 1307, let's say. Okay. Now, notice that the red goes up over the green comes down under, but notice that this triangle right here is neither in the red triangle. The red triangle goes just up and over it, and the green triangle goes underneath it. And so it occupies a piece of the subsidy that is neither producer surplus nor consumer surplus. This is deadweight loss also because we have more trades going on than the market would naturally have. And we'll talk about, so why subsidize? Well, because the government thinks we should do more of this. Okay. And so that's why we subsidize. But a subsidy, like a tax, causes us to do either, well, in this case, more trades than we would naturally do. A tax causes us to do fewer trades. And so there is a deadweight loss here. All right. How much is the deadweight loss? Well, it is the width of the triangle. Well, let's do the height. The height is 103.5 minus 93.5, right? That's 10 because it's going to be the same height as so that's 10. It's the same height as the subsidy. And then the width of the triangle is 3130 minus 30, and then times a half. So 103.5 minus 93.5 is 10 times 3130 minus 31.3 times 0.5, 6.5. Okay. I think that is all of them. Let me go back. Okay, so we came up with the equilibrium price of that she's going to receive would be 103.47, and she's going to do 31.3 visits. With the subsidy in place, what would be the out-of-pocket cost of an appointment with Morgana? It's going to be 93.47, right? For the consumer. What's the cost of the subsidy? We said 313. What is the deadweight loss? 650. And I threw in calculating the producer surplus and consumer surplus. I didn't realize I hadn't asked that. So get that as a bonus. All right. Enjoy.